Okay, let's talk about some more cell phone DC electronics. This is part 8, the decimal numbers. So we looked at how to read a multimeter and what the symbols mean. So let's talk about the decimal numbers and what the heck they mean, because that's tough. It's not easy. Um, Essentially, if you have a whole number, it's usually a whole part of that measurement, of that unit, right? So like for instance, a volt. 1 volt is one whole volt, but there's fractions of a volt. Most of the time when you're measuring a volt, you're measuring within either an entire volt or a millivolt, which is the 3 zeros just behind the decimal. Anything behind the decimal, the first 3 zeros behind that decimal are always milli. And then you wouldn't see micro or nano too often for volts, but then there's micro, which is the 3 zeros behind the milli, and there's nano, which is even further behind the milli by another 3 zeros. So, and this comes into play when you're measuring other types of properties, such as a resistor. So a resistor oftentimes is higher in value, and so you wouldn't see too much of a resistor on the right side of the decimal, on the lower side of the decimal, a fraction of an ohm, but you may see some milliohms sometimes, especially in small electronics. You might see some milliohms. Another way you would see numbers on the right side of electronics is through some other components, most likely capacitors or inductors, which we haven't talked about, but let's get this number thing down first. So the first 3 zeros behind a whole number in electronics are milli. So millivolts, milliohms, millihenries, millifarads, right? Anything behind the right, anything on the right side of the decimal, the first 3 numbers are going to be milli. And then if you look down, the little bit sign or micro sign, it's a little Greek symbol, and it means micro, and that's the 4th through the 6th zero, and that's micro. So anything in there is going to be micro of whatever property. And then you have nano, which is the 7th through the 9th. And then just under that, if you look, the first 0 is hundreds. So if you have 0.1, that's 100 milli. So if you have a 0.1 volt, you have 100 millivolts. 100, 0.100, it's 100 millivolts. Now if you have point, okay, so second 0 is tens. So if you have 0.01, that's 10 millivolts. 0.010, that'd be 10 millivolts. Now let's move on to micro and talk about that. Now if you had 0.000001, you would have 1 microvolt. That's 1 because it's in the ones place. The third zero is the ones. For nano, if you had 0.0000000, that's 6 zeros, and then a 1, you have 100 nano of something. So if it was amps, you would have 100 nanoamps, which isn't a lot. That's not enough to charge really anything or to power anything. So this is our decimal numbers, and we'll look at the other side of that when we talk about some other components. But a lot of times when you're measuring voltage or other Ohm's law properties, you might see some things on the right side of the decimal. So it's good to know these things.